You gotta be more specific than that.
Like,
What scene?
or what song is playing?
Going once?
Who's most sugar?
No. Oh, it skipped right by it, didn't it? I actually wanted to play that. Back you. Prancing is my favorite part of this. All right, so as you may have gathered, the theme of today's lecture is kites. Actually, that looks really tiny. That's going to be the example that we're going to use as we walk through. So keep kites in mind. So this is the second of the professional development series. And we're looking today specifically at user needs. I'll go into what those are, some of the things I want you to take home today, how to identify who the stakeholders are in your project. Okay, first of all, you need to know who you're working for. How do you formulate user needs? So how do you write them down in a way that makes sense? What are some tools for obtaining them? So the three main ones we're going to talk about are going to be observation, surveys, and interviews. So these are three very common techniques. If another technique works for you, use it. This isn't limiting, it's just some suggestions. And then finally, how to build a kite. But I think we might not have time for that, so I'll take that one out. I won't expect you guys to have to actually build anything. So let's jump right into an exercise. What I want you to do before I talk about user needs is just, on your own individually, write down a list of user needs for a kite. So imagine you work for Purdue Kite Company. We're coming out with our new fall line just in time for winter. And you need to design a kite. So write down all the user needs you can think of in a few minutes. All right, is everybody, I know that's probably less than 4 minutes, but everybody get a chance to write some down, got some ideas? All right, let's keep moving on. So hang on to those user needs that you wrote down. We'll come back to them in just a little second. But first I want to talk to you, if we're going to come up with user needs, we need to talk about what is a user. So a user is the person who directly interfaces with the product you're making. So for example, I use a smartphone. I am the user, right? I send emails on this. I type on it. It sits in my pocket. I'm the user. But there are a lot of stakeholders. So a stakeholder is anyone who's influenced by a product, right? Anyone who's affected by it. So if, for instance, on my phone it had an obnoxiously loud ringtone and it went off in the middle of lecture, that would affect all of you. So you're all stakeholders in the design of my phone, right? Or imagine my phone put off some kind of terrible radiation that gave people brain tumors, and you guys sitting in this room with me all went home with one today. That would stink, right? So you guys are all stakeholders in that. There's a lot of stakeholders in any product, and it's really a lot bigger group than you would think. So when we talk about stakeholders, think about, the investors of the company that you work for, or the project partner is your obvious one, but who else is affected by your project partner, right? So let's take just one more minute, do a quick activity, and let's do this one together. Let's talk about all the stakeholders in the design of a kite. I will volunteer up the first one, which is the user, who would be the kite flyer, right? Give me another user or another stakeholder for a kite. What? A board. Oh, a bird. A bird. Gotcha. Sorry. A bird. Birds. Okay. Give me another one. Who else could be? Who? Observers. Okay. Pretty visual. Any others? Yeah, go ahead.
Like West Coast flags if it gets stuck in a tree or on the house.
Okay, okay. Neighbors, lack of a better term. I know there's one back there. Okay, so the retailer, yeah. Who else? Manufacturer, absolutely. Right here we had one right here. That was, you were going to say manufacturer as well? So those are great examples. So again, say Purdue Kite Company is a publicly traded company, or it's owned by a bunch of students, right? So you who don't work for the company but own it will have a stake in that, right? So that's a good example. Let's say, so we had observers visual. What about, say you're out at the beach, right? And you've got this kite in high wind, and we make the kite out of titanium, right? And it flies down and hits some kid in the head, right? So because you used a stiffer material, which actually it's a lighter weight material, but say you made it out of stainless steel or something like that, right? And it went and whacked somebody, or it was sharp, right? So there's a lot of people involved who can be affected by your product. So as you guys are working on your projects, keep in mind that you have your project partner and you're looking to serve their needs, but it's really a lot bigger group that you want to serve. And when we talk about user needs, it's a little bit of a misnomer because we're really thinking about stakeholder needs. Right? So most of our user needs will be about our user, but we really want to think about all of the stakeholders. So we don't want to limit it just to our user, but look at the broader group that's affected by it. And it will affect your design in a lot of ways. So now that we've talked a little bit about who users are, what does a user need? A user need is very simply the primary functions of the device, right? So what are the, or sorry, not functions, but features. What are the features of the device? What should it do? How should it look? How big should it be? Things like that. And it's a fuller statement of the project scope. So most of you were here last week. We talked a lot about project scope, and that was a one sentence. We wanted it to be very specific, but it was like a one sentence description of your product, right? Your user needs are going to go and take that sentence and hash it out into a page or pages of or not specifications, but of statements on what this should do. So you all wrote down some examples in the beginning. Give me a few of those examples. What were some user needs? And summarize them in a succinct fashion so I can write it on the board. Everybody wrote some down. Everybody should have one. Throw me out one. Lightweight? Okay. Okay. Right behind. Should fly? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
String, so it doesn't break.
Okay, strong. Yeah. Easy to handle. Jessica?
Should have something for the user to actually hold the kite easily with.
Tether. Okay, so aesthetic. Easy to assemble. Great. What are you noticing about all these? Who are you thinking about? Thinking about the user, right? Do any of these really pertain to those other people? So think about the retailer, right? So one of your user needs should be this thing needs to fit in a package that you can put on a shelf at a store, right? Because if you have a big contraption that, you look at some of the kites that you see out on like a beach that are assembled, if you tried to sell that assembled, it would take up so much shelf space, no one would sell it. Right? So you gotta come back to these things. So your retailer, your manufacturer, nobody said this should be easy to make, right? So you need to make it such that it has cheap materials that are reliable, that can be manufactured quickly. So observers is a good one. We've got those in there. We didn't really think about birds. We didn't put safety in here, right? I hope that's not a big issue, but it could be. But you see my point here, that there's a lot more. We tend to focus in on just the one user, right? So one of my teams were developing devices for the Indiana School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and we're all thinking about the students. And then we went down on our project partner visit and we said, we gotta think about the teacher, right? The teacher really is one of the key pieces in this. They're one of our key stakeholders. So they're not using the device directly per se, but they're the ones who need to communicate with the students. And they need to teach them how to use it. So there are a lot of stakeholders involved and there are a lot of user needs. So those are some great examples. So as you guys go into your projects and you're starting to write out user needs, we're still early in the semester. A lot of you are probably still at that stage if you're starting new projects. And if you're not starting new projects, you might want to go back and say, has our project kind of languished for a few semesters? Maybe our user needs aren't specified well enough. Maybe that's why we're drifting outside. So some excellent examples. What are not user needs? So you guys actually did a really good job. I was a little bit surprised in a good way that these are really user needs. So you didn't get into design specifications. So that's a little bit different. So in design specifications, you're not going to say it's lightweight. You're going to say it needs to be less than 3 pounds. Okay? So specifications are where we translate these user needs that are in plain English into more engineering terms. Okay? So that's when you want to go through and give quantitative measures to all of those user needs. I will warn you, so I talk a lot about user needs and specifications. The nomenclature in industry and in academia is really cluttered on these words. So you'll hear some people call user needs specifications and they'll call specifications design inputs. I don't know what the right way to do it is. Everyone does it a little bit differently. I think there's not really well accepted definitions. So we'll use these, but just be aware if you go into your job when you leave here or another class and you hear these same concepts but with a different name, it's the same thing. So don't be afraid of it. Nothing to worry about there. So coming from medical device industry, these were user needs and design inputs. So specifications wasn't really a term that we used. But that was the term in EPICS terminology, so it's what we'll use. Does that make sense to everybody? So get the concept? Great. So now you understand user needs are. So how do we find the user needs? How do we know them all? What if we have no experience doing what we're doing? So probably most of you have flown a kite. Has anyone never flown a kite? No, you all have. It's a pretty universal toy, right? Most places in the world have seen a kite. But if you think about, you're going into the School for the Blind example I just gave. Most of you are not blind or visually impaired. So if you were, how do you put yourself in those people's shoes? You're going to have to use techniques to get their user needs. There'll be several we talk about. Before I jump into the next slide, I just want to preempt it a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of your mindset for gathering user needs as an R&D person, so as design development, as opposed to someone in sales. The reason I feel the need to do that is because I've seen it done incorrectly a lot, and because the natural urge is there to be a salesperson in all of us, because we all have worked hard on something and want other people to like it. But while you're in an R&D capacity, you really don't want to do that. So in sales, you want to deliberately interject bias. So you want people to think that whatever you have designed and built is better than it really is. Does that make sense to everyone? So when you look at, Apple just launched their new iWatch or whatever it's called, Apple Watch. And they have them on like nice little podiums with a loop playing through to show you everything it can do. So they don't put it on a cardboard table and let you go pick it up and go, just use it, because they really want to push you to like the product, right? And as a salesperson, and even as an engineer, when you're talking with your boss someday, and your director or vice president of a company, and you say, look at this great new idea I've got. You want to be persuasive and pitch it. But when you're in development, you really don't want to do that. So what you want to know is, what is really wrong with this that I can fix? Where could I improve it? Where are the points where things don't happen? So this is where you want to be really honest, okay? So try and keep that bias and that kind of persuasive mentality out of it as you do these things. So again, I'm going to talk about three techniques: observation, interviewing, and surveys. The first of these, observation. So what is an observation? And I will say all of these techniques work really well for validation at the end of your project as well. So you use these techniques to get user needs, and then you can use them again to validate your user needs. So up front you'll say, what is it that my user needs? And then at the end you'll say, I've given them this product and I've observed them, or I've done an interview and discovered that we've met their user needs. Okay, so that's validation. So observation is simply watching a user or a subject do something in their natural manner, where you're not interjecting yourself upon them. Okay, so in the case of a kite, you go out to a park and people are out flying kites, and you just make notes and observations about how they're using it. Or if it's a device that doesn't exist anymore, or doesn't exist already, or you have an early prototype, you might give that to a user group and inform them, say, I'm going to step back, just use it as you would, and I'm going to take notes. Okay. So pros and cons of observation: it introduces the least amount of bias. So you're putting yourself into their opinions the least, okay, and affecting them the least. It's also the most honest form of information that you'll get. So people oftentimes think they do things differently than they really do them. Okay. A great example of that, in the design of houses, people like to put a lot of money into their outdoor spaces. And there was a survey done saying, how much time do you spend outside at your home? People would say, oh, I spend 10 hours a week outside. And then they observed these people without asking them, and they spent maybe 10 hours a year outside, right, on average. So it's much less than you thought. So that's one of those cases where your opinion of what you do is not really matched up to what you actually do. And that happens all the time. Some of the cons, it'll give you the how information, so how they do something. I'm out flying the kite, it'll show you how they launch the kite, how they hold it, how they steer it, but you don't know why they're doing that. You're not getting any of their history, so you don't know where they're coming from. And it may take a long time to obtain sufficient data. So watching someone fly a kite is pretty easy, but say you are wanting to watch someone perform open brain surgery. Well, it might take 12 hours for one surgery, and you need to get 500 surgeries. It's going to take you a while to do that through observation, so you may want to do a different technique like interviewing. So an interview is where you sit down with someone. It could be one interviewer with a group of interviewees. It could be the opposite, so you could have a panel of people doing the interviews, and it usually is best if you have more than one interviewer. I'll talk about that a little bit. But interviews, you're asking someone about their history with something, okay? So pros and cons on interviewing: it's more personal than a survey. So you're there in person, you're interacting with the person, and it allows open dialogue. So you can let them drift the conversation, find out what's important to them, and you can dig deep into those whys. So you watched an observation, you watched a kid fly a kite, and they took off running to start getting the kite in the air, right? And you had never flown a kite, you didn't know why they did that. So then you can say, hey, why did you have to run to get the kite going? They could explain to you that, it gets it into the wind and gets enough speed to get lift. The negatives are you're putting yourself in the situation. So it's very difficult to ask completely unbiased questions. Okay, so you may not realize it, but when you're saying, what do you think about this? You have physical cues with your body language as well as verbal cues. And it can get really bad into like, don't you think that this is better than that? Okay, that's bad. That's not the kind of questions we want to ask. So we don't want to introduce bias into our responses, and it's also dependent on the interviewee. Okay, so most of the times as students, when you've interviewed people for a project, they've been very willing participants. As you get into industry, sometimes you'll be paying people for their time, so you're really limited on the amount of time that you get, or you're asking an expert who really values their time. So say you're interviewing someone in the workplace and they're very busy. They may only give you 5 minutes. So you may have a limited amount of information you can get from them, where they may be willing to let you follow them around all day and observe them as long as you don't bother them. Okay? So some differences there. Going on from interviews, last one we'll talk about is surveys. So surveys are written questionnaires, could be online or on paper, where you write out a list of questions. Maybe they're open answer, maybe they're fill in a box kind of thing. But the pros and cons there, it's easy to compile the information when you're done. So it's really challenging with observation notes or interview notes because you have to manually transcribe your notes into data if you're wanting data. Surveys are kind of naturally data. Usually you can say 10% of people said strongly agree. That's easy to compute. They focus on getting specific answers to questions. So if you have a very particular question on your kite, you want to know if it should be red or blue. And a survey is a great way to do that because you can ask a whole lot of people, right, and get an opinion instead of interviewing a small pool. They do introduce bias in the way that you write the questions, so probably less so than an interview where you have personal interaction, but it is there. The downsides are they're impersonal, so you don't get to meet your user, you don't build empathy with them, and there's no open-ended or anecdotal responses. So you find in design a lot of times, as a design team, you sit around and say, you remember when that user said that they really didn't like doing this because of this, and you had never thought of that before? You won't get that in a survey because it's closed. Even providing open-ended text questions, you really don't get to the same level as a more personal method. So going into some kind of practical suggestions on interviewing and observation. So for me, I would recommend that you do all three of these when you go to get user needs and when you go to do validation. And the way that I've usually done that is create an interview guide that is both interview and observation, okay? And then when I've done with my interview and observation, I'll leave the user with a survey, okay? Or maybe if you want to expand your survey pool, you can send that out to more people. But that way you get those personal insights and you allow your users to tell you what's important to them, but you can still get that hard data that you need to make justified answers, okay? So when you're preparing to do an interview or an observation, the steps are very similar. And like I say, I usually will combine these if at all possible. So you know, if you have an early prototype of your kite, you might bring it in to an interview room and put it on the table. A kite's kind of a bad example for that because you need to do it outside, hopefully. But you get the idea. You have a new computer, right? You put it on the table and say, "This is what I've got," and then you'll mark in your interview guide certain questions that you want to have as observations. Those are observation cues. So on those things, you're telling yourself, look to see what is their facial reaction when they turn the computer on. Are they excited, or are they kind of like? So those kind of things. Or with your kite, maybe you want to know how they take off with the kite, but you don't want to ask them and have them be, you know, kind of nervous about it or thinking about it. You just want them to act naturally. So maybe you'll write, observe how the user launches the kite, and we'll put an observation symbol. So an eyeball is a really easy one. You'll usually type these so you can do it on a computer, but an eyeball is just a football with a circle in it. Eyeball, right? So that's easy to do. So try and prepare those things. And that just gives you, as you're looking through your questions, it says, this is one that I can just watch them, write it down. It gives you a cue. And if you sequence your questions well, that'll really help you, because you can say, here are the steps of launching a kite, flying a kite, and landing a kite. I'm going to write my questions in that order. So I can sit there, the user is launching the kite, and I'm following beside him saying, oh, I see that you did this. How did you do that? I wonder, when you normally fly a kite, how do you do this? Oh, that kite up there is beautiful. Do you like that red, or would you rather have blue? Things like that, right? So you can interact with them while you observe them. Sometimes you want a really pure observation. That's usually more scientific for product design. It's usually okay to talk with them, as long as you're kind of keeping yourself out of the bias loop. I guess the one thing I didn't touch on there, critical questions. So usually you'll build an interview guide, and when you think about your design, you'll have 200 questions. And no one is ever going to answer all of those questions unless you're paying them. So mark your critical questions, keep all of those questions, and if you get a really willing user who wants to talk your ear off, let them and fill in all your questions. But if you have someone who's in a hurry, get to those critical questions, right? Because sometimes you'll have a question that you can't move on without. So say you're designing this kite, and you need to know if it should have a steering mechanism or if it's just going to be a single line up in the air. You can't design any of the physical body of your kite. You can't move on at all until you know that answer. So that's a critical question. You need to have that answered. So mark that in your guide so you don't miss it. And try and get that from as many users as you can. And then the other kind of questions, like, do you like stripes or polka dots? Maybe you put in there, but you don't indicate it as critical. So if you run out of time, you don't ask it. So this is very text heavy from here on out as I give you an indication in this slide. I apologize for that. I think we're doing fine on time, so nothing to worry about. But I don't like a lot of text in slides. but there's a lot of information here I didn't want to miss, so we're going to go this way. So practical interviewing, when you get into creating your interview questions, there's some things you're going to think about. So good questions or good questions come from good forms. And good forms are things like, they'll be open. Tell me about a time when you did this, right? So that's kind of how job interview questions go, but they can go this way for design questions as well. Because what that gives is the user a chance to lead the conversation, find out what's important to them. Because one of the main things you're looking for in an interview is empathy with your user. You're wanting to understand where they're coming from. Because the more you can put yourself in their shoes, the better you'll be able to design for them. Okay? So avoid closed questions that have one answer or one word answers. So what's your favorite color? One word answer, that's not great, but if you say something like, you know, what kind of aesthetics do you like in a kite? That gives them the opportunity to broaden and talk about what's important to them, because maybe they don't care about the color, but they care about the pattern. Or maybe if you're talking to my kids, they would really care about seeing characters from Tangled or Frozen on there, and that would be great, but if you put a generic dinosaur, they wouldn't care. Right? So those are the kind of things that you might not know to ask until you let them lead the interview. Avoid conjunctions. So I've seen some questions come from EPICS teams that say things like, what kind of color do you like and what kind of pattern do you like? Don't do that. Say, what kind of color do you like? And then say, what kind of pattern do you like? Separate questions. Okay? It's very confusing to people, especially in a verbal interview when you ask them compound questions. So try and avoid that. And again, avoid leading questions. So you hear this over and over. Avoid bias. Don't lead questions. Don't say, wouldn't it be better if Purdue had a pizza restaurant on every street corner? Because everybody would be like, yeah, it would. That would be great. I like to eat pizza every day, and I like variety. So don't give those kind of leading questions. Let people do that. So more good forms. Show me how you. Walk me through how you. Walk me through how you is a great one, right? So if you're going into someone who has a specialized field, like you're going in to talk to a teacher at the School for the Blind, you say, show me how you administer an exam, how you write an exam for a blind student, right? So that's something that you might have no experience with as a sighted person, but they have a lot of experience with and can help you from their history. So keep those in mind, and project ahead is a great one too if you're looking for expanded feature sets. So we talked last week about minimum viable product. Well, when you're going from minimum viable to I want all the bells and whistles, that what do you think this should do in 5 years question really can spur people to give you those kind of insights, right? So if I asked you right now what you think your laptop should do in 5 years, probably most of you would say, you know, there shouldn't be a monitor anymore, it should be a hologram, and I don't know. But it might get me some insights into the things that you want to see. So your approach when you sit down to do an interview, remember this is a social human interaction. So again, gaining empathy. So you're not looking to just get information, but you're looking to understand your user. So it's not a verbal survey. Your job is not to sit there and say, I've got 100 questions on my questionnaire. I'm going to ask them word for word. Feel free to be conversational. Ask the questions like a human, not like you're just reading them a survey. So you may have written down, you know, what type of pattern do you like to see in a kite? And you say, how do you like a kite to look? That's okay. Right? You're going to get to the same information. Just try and be conversational, be yourself, open up with them, and that'll get them to trust you and give you information. And again, give the subject freedom to lead the conversation because they know what's important in the design that you're making for them more than you do. As you get into a product, if you've done an iteration and you're coming back to iterate on user needs, which happens a lot, at that point, sometimes you will have really specific questions that you need answered. Okay, so keep that in mind. So that may be you're designing a new jetliner, right? And you want to know about how much legroom someone needs. You might have a model of that set of legroom. Say, could you sit in this for me and tell me what you really think about it? Is it that bad, right? So those are the kind of situations where you can build observation and interviewing in together as well. Remember, interviews are about the person before the product. Try and interview a wide sample of people. Interviewing is one of the hardest ways to do that. Observation also is kind of difficult. So surveys are really great for volume responses. So goals, I think we've talked about these a little bit. Gaining empathy. Again, interviewing is really about someone's history. So when you go to do an observation, you're finding out about their right now. So how are you doing this thing right now with the example I've given you, right? So if this projector were something that I was designing and this was my prototype, I'm going to see how they're using this one. Where in an interview, they don't have the projector, you're saying, how have you used a projector in the past? What color did you like? Was it bright enough? Things like that. Okay, so you're asking about the history of the product. So it's a little bit different. You are looking to understand the feature preference and the relative importance. So when you get through your user needs, you'll almost always have contrasting user needs. So for instance, we didn't have cost here, but cost is almost always one that contrasts with everything else you have. Okay, so you will always have user need that it should be low cost or at some cost point, right? So maybe lightweight, maybe it really should be made out of carbon nanotubes or something, but that was more expensive than balsa wood, for instance, right? So those are the kind of things to keep in mind. You'll always have competing user needs. Make note of how important they are to your user. So as you write down your user need, try and understand when you get into conflicts, how do you resolve those? And again, not important to answer every question that you have. When you get done with an interview, the sooner you can debrief with your interviewing team, the better. So if there are 5 of you in a project team, you're all doing interviews with the same person or different people, or some of you are doing interviews, some of you are doing observations. As soon as that activity is done, find a quiet coffee shop, conference room, somewhere where you can get together and review. Because within hours, you start to forget details, and within a day, you've forgotten a lot of the critical information. So it's really important to get together and assimilate that information. And what you're looking to do is to cull the user needs out of your notes, okay? So you're looking for these kind of things that you wrote down. It really needs to be easy to handle. Those are the kind of things that you're trying to say. We talked to 10 different people. 8 of them really made a point of they had kites in the past that were hard to handle, or they had no steering. They just sat up there. And so those are the kind of things you're trying to pull out. So look for those trends, try and get user needs out of them, and don't overreact to early responses. So if you're going to do 3 or 4 sessions of interviews, and after the first set of interviews, and say there's a time between them, after the first set of interviews, everybody said the kite has to be blue. And you're like, we got to change everything. It's got to be blue. It can't be red and pink polka dots anymore. Well, that first set of users may have been an anomaly to your overall group, so don't overreact. So a great example of this, I was designing a set of surgical instruments 2 years ago, and we had a cadaver lab with a bunch of surgeons. So we had 10 surgeons from Europe in a room, and they all had very strong opinions in one direction on what we should do with the design of these instruments, okay? So they were saying they all need to have really ergonomic handles with overmolded plastic and be really comfortable. That's the main thing that they cared about. And then when we got to the US, interviewed this same size set of surgeons, they all said, we don't want any of those handles on it. We hate those things. They get bugs stuck in them, and then our patients get infections. We don't want that. So we had 2 exactly opposite sets of user needs, but because we had to schedule these meetings with the surgeons a couple of months apart, we had redesigned almost everything to have the handles that the first group asked for, and then come back to find the second group disagreed completely. And when we met with a group of surgeons from Asia, they had the same opinion as the US surgeons. So it's like, well, we got 2 out of 3, we have to move forward with something. So those are the kind of situations where if you get those early responses and you put all your effort into redesigning things, it can be a total waste of time, and you're going to go back the other way. So be patient, don't overreact. The observation guidance is very similar to the interview guidance. So when you go to do observations, I talked about a little bit, create observation cues. So these you want to write down, you're not writing it as a question, you're writing it as a statement to yourself to look for something. So say, observe how the user, say you're going on a phone. Observe how the user logs into the phone, or how they take it out of their pocket. Right? So there's some things in observation that people don't know the answer to, but might be important to you in ergonomics. So say you're designing a cell phone case. Right? It might be really important to you how someone gets it out of their pocket. Right? I'm getting chalk all over myself, but I keep it in my right front pocket. That might be important to you, okay? Because maybe you're building it to be anatomically shaped, right? So maybe it's handed. Or maybe you're wondering, does it catch on my pocket, or things like that. So if I was someone who kept it in my purse, which I don't carry, that might be a different situation. So those are things that you want to look for. Ergonomics, how people interact with devices. So if you talk to some of the interaction design students that we have floating in a few of the teams, they could talk to you a lot more than I could about how to make those observations and how to get good user needs out of them. So in your approach for this, if you're giving the user something, a prototype, something to use, you're not just going to look at people in their natural environment. Let them know you'll be observing, and just tell them, pretend I'm not here, I'm just going to be taking notes, because you want to influence them as little as possible. Okay, so again, my past job, we had to go in and do ethnographic research, which is a fancy term for doing these kind of observations and taking notes on hospital clean rooms. So we had designed instruments for surgeons for years, and we had never really thought about hospital clean rooms because they cleaned instruments and they came back out and that was fine. But one of the new requirements that we had was that they needed to be disassemblable so that you could clean between every crevice. So think you've got a pair of pliers or something. Every one of those has to come apart, right? Every tool in your, none of you have garages, but every tool you have has to come apart. And then you're telling the people in the clean room they have to take them apart, clean them, and put them back together. There's a lot of risk there, because if they can't figure out how to put it back together and it gets into surgery and the surgeon goes like this because he doesn't look what he's doing, or she, and the tool's in two pieces or falls apart, that's really bad, right? So that can delay surgery and cause infections and all kinds of problems. So, we had to go in and interview them. And you'd be surprised how much situations like that where people work in a specialized environment are like another culture, okay? So they'll have terminology that you don't know, much like another language. They'll have behaviors you don't know, and they'll have done the things that they do for so long you won't understand. They won't understand that there's a system they follow, right? So we would ask a lot of the people, how do you know which instruments to put in which case of instruments when we would go in and do that? And they say, I just know. I've just been doing this for a long time. I've seen these all before. And they're like, really? And then we go talk to their manager and they say, when they put this through, we put barcodes on all these and it populates a list of the instruments, and they look at that and they know, there's number codes on it. So it's like, so you're telling me you just know, but you have this system in place where you have barcodes in an inventory. And so it's one of those situations where you look at it and you go, how do I train someone who thinks they just know how to do something inherently? But at some point they were trained. So those are the kind of situations where, going in and observing and just building an understanding of how people work, how they do things are important. And all of your project teams work with a project partner that will have some specialized culture. Okay. So present the task or the object you're going to do in as close to the real scenario as you can. So you don't want to take someone who's flying a kite into an indoor wind tunnel and have them hold the kite, because it's going to be nothing like the environment they're used to. So try and get the real world environment, because maybe they are at the beach and they put sunscreen on their hands and they're slippery, and if you use plastic line, it would fall out of their hands, those sorts of things. So just keep that in mind. Try and get the real world environment. Avoid interjecting yourself into the observation. So do try not to be obtrusive. A lot of times people are uncomfortable having someone shadow them or watch them. And try to observe as wide of a sample of real users as you can. Some of your goals here, again, gain empathy for the subject. So in observation, that's often the biggest one. You're just trying to understand how people do their job or how they use things they use. So if you work at, or if you work for the project that works with Wabash Center, right? They have specialized workflows there. You're going to figure out how they do that. If you are working with the zoo team, at the zoo they have special procedures for everything because they're dealing with animals. They don't want to escape and those sorts of things. So try and understand where they're coming from, why they want the things they want, and get an understanding about that. Again, feature preference and relative importance. This can be kind of hard to glean from observation, but it's there. So if you see someone say in an interview, it's never important to me, what color it is, and then you observe a retail store and you look to see what people buy and everybody grabs the green one, they didn't think it was important, but it was. Okay. And again, usually not critical to observe every cue in your guide, just like not important to ask every question, but you're just trying to gain an understanding so that you can put yourself in their shoes and design better for them. Because everyone designs really well for themselves. So most of you have done the wallet exercise at some point. You draw that first wallet, and it's exactly the right wallet for you. And then you go through these iterations with your partner, and you're thinking about what do they want, and how do they live their life, what are the things that are important to them, and you design a completely different wallet, right? So we're all good at designing for us, and we design better for other people when we can empathize and we can put ourselves in their shoes. So surveying is the last one. Practical surveying. This is a little bit simpler, I guess, overall, because it's less personal, and most of you are engineers, and we're good at impersonal things, right? We don't have to put ourselves in a weird situation where I have to socialize with somebody. That's awkward. But I can sit at my computer and write questions. That's no problem. So we like to do these. It can be a little lazy sometimes, so don't get in the trap of only doing surveys, because there's a lot you miss there, right? It's really, how many of you have done project partner visits ever? At some point, several of you have. Was it extremely enlightening into your project? Right? It always is. Because you put yourself in that kind of weird situation where you have to go socialize with someone who's completely different than you and ask them a bunch of questions. But when you leave, you know that person and you understand where they're coming from and why you're doing what you're doing. When you do surveys, make your survey straightforward and as short as you can. Okay? So ask focus questions that get at specific issues. So, do you want the kite red or blue? Yes or no, right? Try and get to those level of questions. Spend time on your format and try and present them in a professional manner. I've seen a lot of bad surveys that look like someone spent 30 seconds on Word typing it out. Take a minute to format it well, print it well, not like a half sheet cut of paper. People will appreciate that extra effort. And keep your questions in a logical order so people aren't confused as you're skipping through them. And keep them appropriate for your audience. So if you have several types of stakeholders here, if you're interviewing or surveying your retailer versus your kite flyer, you have a completely different set of questions. Don't ask your retailer or your kite flyer questions, right? So tailor it to your audience. That's very important, and it should be pretty obvious how that will go. So that is surveying. Does anybody have questions on surveys? So usually, I think doing really good scientific surveying is a field all of its own, but for the purposes of design, we're usually just looking at getting specific answers to questions. And if you've documented your user needs well, then those questions, or if you've thought them through well, those questions will really be straightforward for you. So that is a talk on user needs. Does anyone have any questions? No? So as you think about your user needs in your project, you'll usually think about your project 99% of your time, and you'll think about your user needs like the first 1%, right? That's the way we all are. We want to get into the design. We're all chomping at the bit to go into the lab and start building. But keep in mind there is a little guy at the end of the string there who's holding the string of the kite. Keep that person in mind. Don't forget about him. I was going to put a picture of me in here, like this, but I was too lazy. So a little bit of homework for this week. This is really going to be tough for all of you, I know. Spend about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, and just think about the user needs for your project. So if you've written them already, go back and look at them. If you haven't written them, this would be a good time just to sketch them down. And think about, how do I make them more encompassing to all the stakeholders that I have, okay? How can I expand my user need group so that I better understand my project and my user, okay? So go through and do that. And then just take 10 minutes, write me one paragraph, short one. Just reflect on, how you've changed your user needs, how you can better understand your user, and just talk a little bit about, in light of everything we talked about today, how you can do a better job with these. I'm sorry if that white isn't showing up well on Purdue Pete's hand. So with that, we'll have some more flying of a kite, and you guys can take off. You guys can leave. You don't have to watch.